In the first hours of Donald Trump's second presidency, his new administration started directing the nation's most powerful agencies to carry out his campaign promises about immigration. That includes activating the Department of Defense in the effort, and that is the strongest military in the world. On Trump's very first day in office, he signed a handful of executive orders launching his promised crackdown on immigration, and he declared a national emergency at the border to empower the military to support border control. On Friday, the first wave of active-duty U.S. troops arrived in El Paso, Texas. Military officials tell NBC News that over the next few days, they expect to receive 1,500 active-duty troops in El Paso to help support the 2,500 who are already on the ground on the southern border mission. The Trump administration is also using military planes to deport migrants who are already in detention in the United States. The U.S., according to Guatemalan officials, the country received 3 planes full of Guatemalan nationals who had been deported from the U.S. this week. Trump intended to send at least some of the deportees to Mexico, but Mexico has refused to accept them. That's according to 2 U.S. defense officials. According to a briefing document obtained by the Washington Post, Trump plans to send 10,000 troops to the southern border. 10,000. Now, sending active duty troops to the border is not new, and it is legal. Both Presidents Biden and Obama sent active duty troops to the border at certain points in their presidencies. But it becomes illegal when active duty members of the U.S. military start carrying out law enforcement functions. This is important. There's a federal law that limits what the military can and cannot do on U.S. soil. The Posse Comitatus Act, which was passed in 1878 as a response to the abuse of military power during the Civil War and Reconstruction, lays this out. It says clearly that federal military forces cannot participate in civilian law enforcement. On paper, that means U.S. military personnel cannot interfere in civilian affairs or execute laws, which would mean, in theory, that the troops sent to the border cannot detain immigrants, they cannot seize drugs from smugglers, they cannot have any direct involvement in deporting migrants. It's not that it's not important work, but it's police work, it's customs work, it's ATF work. It is not military work. And that is a very, very important distinction in a democracy. However, the Posse Comitatus Act is vague. It has all sorts of gaps. For example, not all members of the military are covered by the act. Despite its name, activated members of the National Guard are not actually national. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, members of the National Guard are rarely covered by the Posse Comitatus Act because they usually report to their state or territory's governor. That means they're free to participate in law enforcement if doing so is consistent with state law, end quote. The law's lack of clarity, combined with the vagueness of some of President Trump's executive actions, gives a concerning amount of leeway to Donald Trump. And one of his executive orders tests the legal limits of using the military to enforce domestic operations. I want to read from one of his executive orders titled Clarifying the Military's Role in Protecting the Territorial Integrity of the United States. Quote, it is the policy of the United States to ensure that the armed forces of the United States prioritize the protection of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the United States along our national borders, end quote. Sovereignty and territorial integrity. Those words are written a total of 19 times throughout one executive order, an executive order that focuses on immigration, not physical territory or land borders. Under the section titled Implementation, President Trump orders the Secretary of Defense to come up with a plan that assigns U.S. Northern Command, which is the division of the military which is tasked with providing military support in North America, the mission to, quote, seal the borders and maintain the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security of the United States by repelling forms of invasion, including unlawful mass migration, narcotics trafficking, human smuggling, and the trafficking and other criminal activities. The term territorial integrity is typically used in regard to border disputes, actual, not fake invasions and annexations by other countries, like if Canada actually tried to take over an American state. In fact, it's a principle under international law cemented in the United Nations Charter that says sovereign states have a right to defend their borders and territories from other nations trying to take their land by force. For example, Ukraine might accuse Russia of disrespecting its territorial integrity by invading its borders and attempting to claim parts of its sovereign land. So you can see how President Trump's invocation of territorial integrity as it relates to migrants coming into the country are not the same thing. What President Trump appears to be doing is equating immigration with territorial integrity in order to justify the use of the military at the border. Donald Trump has spent years fear-mongering about immigration. It dates all the way back to his foray into politics in 2015 and that fateful ride down the escalator at Trump Tower. He's painted migrants who cross the border from Mexico as drug dealers, criminals, murderers, and rapists. And for many people in America, that tactic has worked. They listened and they believed him. And now he's using the fear that he created to validate the use of the military to deter immigration. Quote, ensure that the armed forces of the United States prioritize the protection of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the United States, end quote. Migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, you may have strong opinions about them. You may think that they don't belong here. Your opinions may be very strong about it. The fact is, they're not actually threatening America's sovereignty or territorial integrity. They are not a risk to our territorial integrity. It's just another fear tactic. And it gets us dangerously close to crossing the Rubicon. It's dangerously close to the U.S. military becoming the commander-in-chief's own personal police force, his own personal militia. Using the military to police civilians on U.S. soil flies in the face of core American values. The situation at the border is a problem that needs to be addressed. But there are solutions that don't involve compromising the integrity of the United States military and lying about its purpose. Appoint more immigration judges. Invest in better technology to keep the border secure. Build more barriers like he's always talking about. Best believe he didn't forget to include the wall in at least one of his executive orders. But at the end of the day, the crisis does not demand the closure of the border with the assistance of the U.S. military. This is not a national emergency. This is not an invasion. This is not a war.